What are you doing here, Elijah? It's a fair question for God to ask of Elijah, one that I think is actually fair for God to ask of each one of us. What are you doing here? But let us begin with Elijah before we get on with us. We must remember as we approach this passage its context. As I mentioned in the previous chapter, we have the description of what is going on in Israel. Elijah had come along and he had prophesied that there would be a great drought. A few years later, he comes back and prophesies the drought will come to an end. He then calls upon the prophets of Baal, these 400 prophets who were subsidized and promoted by Jezebel the queen, to a match on top of Mount Carmel. And so they go up on Mount Carmel, and he has that great contest in which he says, let's see whose God is the real God. And so, just a very brief description, the prophets of Baal build their altar, they put their sacrifice on the altar, they march around all morning and into the afternoon, calling out for their God to take their sacrifice, and nothing happens. And if you really need to read it in chapter 18, because Elijah's standing on the sideline through this whole thing, kind of making fun of him. You know, he's saying things like, maybe your God's asleep, you should yell louder, and, you know, he's doing all these things. So finally they give up and they say, okay, Elijah, it's up to you. And if you remember the scene, Elijah has his altar built out of the stones. And he places on the stones the wood, then he places on that his sacrifice, and then he has his servants dig a trench around it, and then he brings water and he soaks the whole thing so that there's water even in the trench. And then Elijah calls upon God to receive the sacrifice. And a ball of fire comes down and consumes the water and the wood and the sacrifice and even the stones on the altar. And everyone is amazed by this amazing thing that he has done. He has called upon the power of God. And then he turns to the Israelites watching and he says, now you see who the real God is. And then he tells them to kill the prophets of Baal, and they do, which makes Jezebel very upset because these are her friends, okay? So she, upon this great victory, he has just called upon God to bring fire from heaven to take his sacrifice. He has turned on the prophets of Baal. The people are with him. And because Jezebel has made a threat against his life, what does Elijah do? He runs away. It has always amazed me. On the feet of this incredible victory, this incredibly miraculous thing, calling upon the power of God, and this woman threatens his life. Now, I'm sympathetic to a woman threatening his life. I mean, you know, I married a redhead. I know what it's like, okay? But he runs away after this tremendous victory. Surely these are great victories of God and his prophet. God had demonstrated through Elijah his awesome power. If there was ever a moment in which we witnessed the fear of God demonstrated, it is here in 1 Kings 18. And yet at the moment of that great victory, Elijah loses his nerve. Having just called upon the power of God, suddenly he's struck with fear and he runs away. We cannot help but be struck that a prophet so powerful as Elijah, and he is often regarded as Israel's greatest prophet, should suddenly be overcome with fear. It staggers the imagination. But let's be honest, let's cut Elijah some slack. He is only human after all, and how sure are you that you would not do the same thing? What people do in response to witnessing the power of God is part of what links these two texts that we read today together. The healed man in the Luke passage is liberated from his demons, and he responds to the power of God in Jesus with awe and respect and reverence. And with that, the desire to remain always with Jesus in thanksgiving. And why would he not? Jesus literally saved his life. He is prepared to be at Jesus' feet forever, and who can blame him? This is understood. It's the way most of us react being in the presence of God. We want to stay there on the mountaintop and bask in the divine presence forever. Think back to that wonderful moment at the Transfiguration before his crucifixion. They go up on the mountain, and Jesus is there to pray. And Moses and Elijah himself appear and speak with Jesus. And what do the disciples want to do? They want to stay there forever and just be there at the feet of Jesus. It's understandable. It's what we all want. But like with the Transfiguration, more is to come. Yes, they saw a great thing, and now something more needs to happen. They must go down the mountain, make their way to Jerusalem, and continue the story. So it is with the Gerasene demoniac. He wants to stay forever, but Jesus has more for him to do. Now, the people of that region, however, previously living in fear of the demon-possessed man, are now so afraid of Jesus' power that they ask him to go away. After all, if Jesus has the power over those demons, what might Jesus be able to do to them? And here again is not an uncommon reaction to the power of God. God's miraculous power still brings to people the same reactions. When we speak of the miraculous power of God, there are many people who scoff at us. They call us silly and ignorant and superstitious. They have no real knowledge or understanding of God themselves. They simply cannot believe that our God has any real power. It's an attitude that is becoming far too prevalent, I believe, in today's world, even among those who claim a belief in God. And yet, have we not witnessed miracles ourselves? I have. And I know that many of you have witnessed them too. And I would say that even more of you, I am confident, have witnessed miracles brought to us by the power of God and yet failed to recognize them. And what are our reactions to such things? Yes, I have witnessed the renewal of faith in people's lives. I have witnessed that renewed sense of awe and honor and reverence to God for what God has done through His prophets or through His people or through His Son. And yes, they want to stay there at the feet of God. But I have also seen others reject all of that. They reject the truth before their eyes, walking away in disbelief, and sometimes something else. I believe they walk away in fear. They are afraid of what they have just witnessed. Again, because if God has the power to do such miraculous thing, what may God do to us? Afraid to face the truth that might make us uncomfortable, or even worse yet, might cause people to make changes in their lives, they run away from God in fear. Though I suspect the far deeper fear is that having witnessed the power of God, they know in their hearts that God will now have certain expectations on them. And that is the most frightening thing of all, that God might want us to do something in return. Simply put, far too many people fear God's power over us. For what is true of all people who come face to face with the divine is that when we witness the power of God, we know that deep down in our hearts, we will never truly be the same. And that is precisely the point. Things cannot be the same as they once were once we recognize the power of God at work in our lives. And neither can we simply go on doing the same things we did before, all the things we've always done for that matter, because there are expectations. Indeed, at that moment, deep in our hearts, I believe that we know that we have to go even beyond doing nothing at all. What Jesus has done for the Gerasene demoniac was a tremendous show of God's power. The desire to stay with Jesus is undeniable, and it's understandable. But Jesus had other plans for that man, saying, "What? Now that you have been healed, go and tell others what God has done for you." For indeed, as is usually the case, the work was not done with the miracle. It had only just begun. The miracle having been accomplished, The man healed. Now he had to go and make sure others knew what had happened. Think of the greatest miracle of all of these, the resurrection. What if those who witnessed the resurrection had said nothing? Where would we be? The resurrection was not the end of the story of Jesus. It was merely the beginning of our story as those who believe in the resurrection. It is worth remembering this because it has meaning for us, these miracles and the command to go and do something. When we witness the power of God, we too must share what God has done. God's reaction to Elijah, though, coming back to the Old Testament, I think is even more compelling. Though we might rightly perceive that Elijah's flight from Jezebel is a failure on his part, God is not without compassion. When Elijah comes to his senses under that broom tree in the wilderness, realizing what he has done, how he has failed by running away in fear, realizing that he is no better than the unfaithful among his people, and now wants to die because of it, God provides for his needs, giving him food and water and a time to rest. And if you're thinking this is reminiscent of Moses, friends, you're supposed to. When Elijah comes to the mountain of God, the mood changes just a little bit. God, it seems, demands an explanation for Elijah's actions, which he has every right to ask. And Elijah, to be honest, sounds, I think, a little bit whiny and self-righteous as he shares his tale of woe. Woe is me. Everybody's sad. Now they want to kill me too. And it would first appear that God simply does not react to Elijah's story, practically ignoring Elijah's reply. Instead, he warns Elijah that he's passing by. Get ready. And this passing is loaded with a great deal of meaning for us. There is wind, there is earthquake, there is fire. All the indicators of God's presence in the time of Moses. But God is not in these, but rather he is perceived in the sheer silence. In other translation, it comes out as the still small voice of God. Because God is now present in the calm after the storm. To his credit, Elijah perceives the presence of God and presents himself to the Lord on the mountainside. But to his deficit, Elijah continues to stick to his story of woe. And I believe that God is not at all pleased to hear it again, because he's heard it before. Imagine when your children give you that same story 2 and 3 times about how it's not their fault. Okay, we get a little more displeased each time we hear it, let's be honest. But they're really good about sticking to that story. And yet here again, the show of power and the presence is not as important as the reaction. Again, God seems to ignore Elijah's failure to stand fast in Israel and the weak excuse for fleeing, but immediately does what? Sends him back to work. Always I hear in this exchange a sympathetic God pausing for a moment to listen and then saying, okay, with a huge roll of the eyes, and now I want you to get back to work. The work of God intends for his servant is not yet done. Again, we should be careful not to be too hard on Elijah. He is as flawed as we are. And I would venture to guess that we have done far less than Elijah in the service of God ourselves. But like Elijah, God still has work to do through us. Also, like Elijah, we have all made our excuses to God, many of them, let's face it, rather flimsy as to why we believe God no longer needs us. Whether we feel we are unworthy because we have somehow failed to live up to the standard of being like the greatest prophet in Israel's history, or because we have those demons in our own past threatening to devour our futures, who torment us and keep us from doing what God wants us to do, or simply because we feel we've done our job and now it should be on someone else. But no, friends, we who have witnessed the power of God will always have more work to do so long as we draw breath in this world. Likewise, we get caught up in the idea that God only speaks through the big shows of power like wind and flame and earthquake, or with that booming voice from heaven. But the reality is, when God desires to give us instruction, it is most likely through that still small voice in the quiet after the storm, or in that sheer silence, that still small voice that speaks to us in our moments of silence when we are open to listening to the Word of God. But the question is, are you willing to listen? When people ask me about prayer, they ask me, how should I pray? And I can give them all of the things, all the tools they need. I got a wonderful book in there, Prayer for Dummies. It tells you exactly what to do. I can give them the Psalms and show them how this is God's great prayer book. Read the Psalms. It tells you how to pray. But the one thing I always remind them is what most people fail to do. They fail to remember that in prayer, we should also be silent and listen for God to speak. We're all very good about throwing our tales of woe at God, of why everybody's done, woe is me, and everybody's done this to me, and oh, God, save me. But how good are we at closing our mouths, opening our hearts and our ears, and listening for the still small voice in the silence? That is the real challenge. So here we are, friends. Whatever reason for your presence in this place today, I would echo the words of God. What are you doing here? Insert your name. What I can answer for you is this: the work of God is not done. And the work God has for you to do is not done. So when God asks, what are you doing here? Tell him what's on your mind. But then listen for what God may be telling you to do next. Because I believe whatever your answer to God's question, what are you doing here? God will answer, okay. And now I want you to do this.